Welcome to this presentation on Nevada's Pupil-Centered Funding Plan. The information was developed in partnership with the Nevada Department of Education, WestEd, and Augenblick, Palick and Associates. This is the second video in the series. Other topics include an overview of the PCFP, revenues for education, allowable uses of PCFP funds, and lastly, coordinating PCFP funds with other state and federal sources. Section 2. PCFP details and calculations. In this section, we'll walk through the basics of how the PCFP allocation for each LEA is calculated and answer some frequently asked questions about PCFP funding calculations. Education funding in Nevada and through the Nevada Plan included over 30 categorical funds with specific intended uses. The PCFP consolidates many of those categorical funds into one consolidated education funding plan. The transition to the PCFP moves Nevada's structure for education funding from a defined spending plan to a more flexible funding plan based on student needs. Categorical funding streams are now combined into the adjusted base allocation of funding per student, adjusting for size and regional differences, or into one of the three weighted funding streams based on student characteristics. Local special education funding is for students with individualized education plans, or IEPs, and auxiliary services funding covers operational costs such as food service and transportation. With fewer defined spending streams, districts and school leaders have more flexibility in determining how to best meet the needs of their students. The PCFP combined many categorical funding streams. However, several funding streams still exist outside of the plan, including adult education, the Education Trust Account, federal funding, Nevada Department of Education and State Board of Education funding, pre-K, professional development, special education, and the Teach Nevada Scholarship. Funding for education under the PCFP has been divided into four primary tiers. First, Tier 1, auxiliary funding for school operations, such as food service and transportation. Tier 2, local special education funding for students with IEPs. Tier 3, adjusted per-pupil-based funding for each student to ensure a guaranteed basic level of financial support for each student. And Tier 4, weighted funding for students identified as English learners, at risk, and gifted and talented. Auxiliary funding is to be used for food service, transportation, and other operational expenses deemed appropriate by the state legislature. Allocations are distributed to school districts only, excluding charter schools, and are based on a 4-year average of a school district's actual reported expenses. Charter schools may receive separate grant funds for similar purposes, such as transportation. Tier 2, local special education funding represents the amount a school district or charter school would transfer from its general fund to maintain its federal Maintenance of Effort, or MOE, requirement. Maintenance of Effort requires that school districts maintain at least the same level of funding for special education from one year to the next. Allocations are based on a district's total actual expenditures in the prior year as reported in the annual financial report. Additional considerations: school districts funded by the fiscal year 2020 baseline retain the flexibility to transfer funding from weighted categories of the PCFP to the general fund. Other school districts also retain the ability to increase the amount of funding for special education services by transferring funding from the adjusted per-pupil-based funding allocation, discussed later in this slideshow, if additional funding is needed for that purpose. These adjustments may impact future federal Maintenance of Effort amounts. Tier 3, the PCFP combines specific local and state revenues to provide guaranteed basic level of financial support for each pupil to receive a reasonably equal education opportunity, regardless of which county they live in. Every student generates an equal allocation of funding that can be used to pay for things such as teacher salaries and benefits, materials and supplies, and other expenditures necessary for running a school or district. This per-pupil funding base is then adjusted based on attendance area and the Nevada Cost of Education Index. This adjusted base funding accounts for the majority of dollars for a school or district's general operating budget. The adjusted per-pupil base allocation is calculated based on the following components: the statewide base, initial amount per pupil, which is the same for every school district, charter school, or university school for profoundly gifted students. The Nevada Cost of Education Index, or NCEI, is a composite multiplier factor to address regional cost differences experienced by school districts due to differences in the cost of labor and goods. The NCEI includes two elements. One, the Cost of Wage Index, or CWI, is a wage measure that calculates the cost of attracting staff due to a variety of community factors. The CWI is applied to the portion of the base funding associated with wages. 2. A cost of goods is applied to the non-wage portion of base funding. Lastly, the attendance area adjustment. This adjustment accounts for the increased cost per pupil to operate public schools in smaller settings that are often in more remote and rural areas. This multiplier is based on attendance areas set by the Nevada Department of Education and provides additional dollars to support these settings and provide a reasonably equal education opportunity to their students. A school district may serve multiple attendance areas and will receive a combined adjustment proportionately based on the relevant attendance area adjustments for each attendance area within the school district. Tier 4, weighted funding. The PCFP provides additional funding to districts on a per-pupil basis through weights for students with additional needs in 3 categories: English learners, at-risk students, and gifted and talented students. Weights are calculated as a percentage of the statewide base allocation that every student receives. Counts for English learners, at-risk students, and gifted and talented students are based on October 1 count validation day data submitted to the Nevada Department of Education from the previous year. Weights are calculated as a percentage of the statewide base allocation that every student receives. The count of students in each of these 3 categories is unduplicated, meaning that students are counted in the highest weighted category in which they qualify, and they cannot qualify for funding for multiple weights. English learners. Using the state's existing definition, the students included in the count for the English learner weight are students who speak a language other than English at home, scored below 4.5 on an English language screener, and do not qualify for special education services. Funding is determined by multiplying the statewide base allocation amount by the 0.45 weight. At-risk students. The state identifies at-risk students who need extra help to graduate with their cohort. To do this, each student is assigned a grad score. This score is calculated by a machine learning computer program that analyzes approximately 75 data points about a student in areas including academic performance, attendance, behavior, and home and economic stability. The program uses these factors to determine how likely a student is to graduate on time. Funding is determined by multiplying the statewide base allocation amount by a 0.35 weight. Gifted and talented students. The state defines gifted and talented as a person who possesses or demonstrates outstanding ability in one or more of the following: general intelligence, academic aptitude in a specific area, creative thinking, productive thinking, leadership, the visual arts, or the performing arts. The PCFP formula provides funding for students who qualify as gifted and talented who did not qualify for additional funding through special education services or through the English learner or at-risk weights. Funding is determined by multiplying the statewide base allocation amount by the 0.12 weight. Let's review the distribution of the weighted funding. First, districts receive an adjusted base allocation for each of their students. Next, districts receive special education funding, and students with disabilities are removed from the pool of eligible students for additional weighted funding. Of the remaining students, students identified as English learners are counted for weighted funding. Of those remaining students, not including those who qualified for special education or English learner weight, students identified as at risk are counted for weighted funding. Lastly, of the remaining students, not including those who qualified for special education, English learner, or at-risk weights, students identified as gifted and talented are counted for weighted funding. Students can only generate funding in one category, but districts can receive funds in some or all categories, depending on the students they serve. At risk, a new measure of student need. The PCFP focuses on students who need the most help. A machine learning computer program analyzes approximately 75 data points about each student in areas including academic performance, attendance, behavior, and home and economic stability. The program uses these factors to determine how likely a student is to graduate on time. The formula provides funding for the students identified in the lowest quintile or 20th percentile of grad scores statewide. The district is eligible for extra funding for those students. Because students who are counted as at risk for funding purposes are identified through a statewide calculation to determine the lowest quintile or 20th percentile of scores, rather than a school district by school district calculation, districts may have more or less than 20% of their students identified and funded with the at-risk weight. Additionally, some of the students with the grad scores in the lowest quintile statewide may also have a disability or be an English learner, in which case they would be supported with the local special education allocation or generate the higher English learner weight. In either case, they would not generate the at-risk weight. Hold harmless. The PCFP also includes a fiscal year 2020 baseline per pupil guarantee, or a hold harmless allocation. The intent of this provision is that a school district receives a reasonably similar level of funding on a per pupil basis that it received during the fiscal year ending on June 30th, 2020. With this baseline guarantee, the intention of the legislature was to be able to transition to the PCFP without causing an unexpected loss of revenue for any school district if the district would receive less funding under the PCFP than it received in fiscal year 2020. This baseline per pupil guarantee is only applicable to districts. Now, we'll review some frequently asked questions about how PCFP funds are calculated. When are students counted for the purpose of funding? The weighted funding is updated each year based on the October 1 count data. NDE will notify school districts, charter schools, and university schools for profoundly gifted students of the updated funding amounts near the end of the calendar year. For example, the October 1, 2021, or fiscal year 2022 count day data will be used to set the weighted funding for fiscal year 2023. NDE provided notification regarding these adjustments near the end of 2022, understanding that many districts and schools begin the budget development process in January of each year. NDE disperses funds to school districts, charter schools, and university schools for profoundly gifted students monthly, beginning on August 1. Each monthly payment is 1/12 of the total legislatively approved amount for auxiliary services, local support for special education services, and weighted funding in the 3 categories for English learners, at-risk students, and gifted and talented students. If a student transfers mid-year, how does that impact funding? Mid-year transfers do not impact funding for that year. Funding amounts are based on student counts from October 1 of the previous year to allow for the state to calculate allocations and for schools and districts to determine budgets in the spring before the school year begins. Because funding is allocated to charter schools and school districts and not to schools within a district or to individual students, no adjustments are made from the state level to account for student mobility between schools within a district, between districts within Nevada, or between Nevada and another state. School and district leaders have the flexibility to determine how to shift resources between schools to best meet student needs. Any changes in student needs and location will be accounted for in the next school year's budget. If a student moves after October 1, this adjustment will be accounted for in the following school year. What if a student qualifies for more than one weight? Pupils who qualify for more than one weighted category must receive the services for each of the weighted categories for which they are eligible. For example, a student classified as both at-risk and an English learner would receive both Victory and Zoom services. And while the PCFP does not include the special education multiplier as a weight, Students eligible for special education services must also receive services for each of the weighted categories for which they are eligible. Because weights are not stacked, students receive funding with the highest weight in which they qualify, in this order: special education funding for students with individualized education plans, English learner students who do not qualify for special education funding, at-risk students who do not qualify for special education funding or the English learner weight, or gifted and talented students who do not qualify for special education funding, the English learner weight, or the at-risk weight. Why does the PCFP use prior year counts rather than funding current enrollment? While exact student counts change from one year to the next, using counts from the prior fiscal year allows budgets to be set and district and school leaders to make spending decisions before the beginning of an upcoming school year. Watch our next section in this series for information on how revenues for education are calculated.